God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Can you believe my first Sunday in this pulpit was July 2nd, 2000? I was a 32-year-old pastor in my third appointment in 6 years. I had a ton of confidence, very little experience. I knew I was coming to a great church, a church that had a tradition of faithfulness and service, and my job was just to not mess it up. Now, 15 years later, I'm standing in the pulpit preaching for my final time as your pastor, and what a ride we've had together, don't you think? When I came here in 2000, Aiea United Methodist Church was in the middle of its centennial year celebration. Now, for churches on the mainland, 100 years is nothing. Like, they sneeze and 100 years goes by, right? But for us in Hawaii, 100 years, that's significant. Christianity hasn't been in Hawaii as long as it has in other places. There's a plaque in the back of the sanctuary on your way out. It's on the right side of the wall, and it lists the first 33 pastors who served this church during our first 100 years. Names like Taike Takahashi, who was our very first pastor, dealing with the plantation workers and preaching from 1900 to 1907. Names like George Cole Jr. Some of you remember him. He pastored here when World War II ended. Glenn Evans, who was known for his dynamic youth and young adult gatherings. Richard Bimson, David Harada, Jim Anderson, Robert Schuler, Pastor Richard Matsushita, who served faithfully here for 14 years. I had to stay 1 year longer than Pastor Dick just to beat the record. He was here from 1981 to 1995. And Pastor Glenn Murray, who preceded me, and he was my pastor for 1 year when I was in high school at Hilo Church, my senior year. The plaque is a long list of distinguished pastors who have given so much of themselves to the mission and ministry of this church, and I'm honored to be added to the list. And I look back not only to where this church has come, but where I have come and how I have grown as a pastor and a person, and I'm reminded of what Feli read for us from the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul's letter to the church in Corinth. Paul was the founding pastor of the Corinthian church. He founded many of the early churches in the Mediterranean region. And when he first came into the city, most of his church members were not Jewish believers of Jesus. They were Greek-speaking folks that came to know and to love Jesus because of Paul's preaching. And so he stayed there for 2 years, and he helped the movement get established, and he helped them settle into a regular rhythm of how they worshiped together and celebrated and reached out in service to the world around them. Well, sometime after he left, a young dynamic preacher by the name of Apollos arrived at Corinth, and he was a Jewish believer of Jesus from Alexandria. Acts 18:27-28 says this about Apollos. On his arrival, he greatly helped those who through grace had become believers, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that the Messiah is Jesus. So he followed in Paul's footsteps. Both he and Paul had grown up in the faith of Judaism and had come to see Jesus as the Messiah and wanted to help their brothers and sisters in that tradition to come to see the grace and peace that comes in following Jesus. Well, the church in Corinth evidently was wont to align themselves with specific leaders, rather than to keep their eye on the bigger picture of who and what they were called to be. So in the first letter to the church in Corinth, Paul says this: "For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people." There's always people that still keep in touch with the pastor after they leave, right? You got to watch out for how the grapevine gets passed. "It has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you. What I mean is that each of you says, 'I belong to Paul,' or 'I belong to Apollos,' or 'I belong to Cephas.'" Cephas was the Greek name for the Apostle Peter. "Or 'I belong to Christ.' Has Christ been divided? Was Paul crucified for you, or were you baptized in the name of Paul?" I love it how he comments on the people that are following him, like his supporters. He's like, "I think I only remember like Gaius and Stephanus. I don't think I baptized maybe one other person, but I didn't come to baptize. I came to preach about Jesus." But in the church in Corinth, they had started to argue and splinter over who their favorite pastors or spiritual role models were. Paul, the founder, Apollos, the fiery preacher, Peter, the rock, or Jesus himself. And Paul says, no, that's not how we do it. I wasn't crucified for you. You weren't baptized into my name. And then comes the real kicker in chapter 3, verses 5 to 7. What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. And I love the wisdom from this letter right here. I planted, he says, I may have started it, but then I got called somewhere else, and Apollos came and kept watering. But through it all, God was the one that grew faith in your hearts. Now, I know in the grand scheme of things, I am just one in a long line of waterers here at Aiea United Methodist Church. Now, for a small portion of you, however, I'm the one who helped plant the seed of faith in your hearts. And now you have the wonderful opportunity to be watered from the ministry of Pastor Tom Choi. And I look forward to hearing from Chloe's people how well the church does once Tom is here, right? I know this congregation will grow in different ways than it did under me because Tom has different skills and abilities, and I think this is a great opportunity for us. And I know that you won't fall into the comparison trap that the Corinthian church did. As I was preparing the second part on this series, Passing the Baton, I thought about a couple stories in the Bible where leaders pass the baton from one leader to another. And a couple weeks ago, we talked about Moses and Joshua. But then the next story that came to mind was Elijah and Elisha. Elijah was a prophet from 1 Kings 17. He was the thorn in the side to the evil king Ahab of Israel. Ahab, it all went south when he picked his bride. He married a princess from Sidon named Jezebel. And it wasn't so much that she was from a foreign land. It was that she was from a foreign land that worshipped foreign gods. So she brought in the worship of Baal, who is the fertility god, and the worship of Asherah, who is another goddess. And so Ahab started following her religious practices as well, so much so that the author of 1 Kings writes this. Ahab did more to provoke the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than had all the kings of Israel who were before him. Right? So here's a king of Israel that is getting God so angry because of his alignment with his wife and her religious preferences. Well, the fireworks really start coming to blow in chapter 18. Elijah challenges Ahab and the priests of Baal and Asherah. There's 850 of them. And he says, all right, it's a time for the showdown up on the mountain. Let's go there. And so it's 1 versus 850, God versus Baal and Asherah. And it was this really amazing story. I commend it to your reading on your own. It involves these two large bulls that were sacrificed and cut up into pieces. And in the middle of a drought, praying for fire to come down from heaven. And when the Baal and Asherah priests aren't able to do that, in order to just take things up a notch, Elijah gets big buckets of water in the middle of a drought to douse the bull that God is going to catch on fire so that it's really, really good and wet, which is one of the things you always want to do when you're starting a fire, right? To douse the things you're about to set on fire. And sure enough, when he prays, God sends fire from heaven, and everyone comes to know that the Lord is the one true God. Well, Queen Jezebel isn't one to be a kind and gracious loser, so she puts a bounty on the head of Elijah. And he freaks out. He decides to flee into the wilderness. God sends an angel to help him get through, and he spends 40 days up on the mountain where God gave Moses the Ten Commandments, Mount Horeb. And it's here on the mountain, after these 40 days of wandering through the wilderness, that God speaks to Elijah. And Elijah says to God, you know what? This is what I get, right? I'm trying to do you a favor. I'm the only one in the whole nation that's standing up for you, and now I'm about to get killed. And God says, you think you're the only one, but you're not. There are thousands of others that haven't worshiped these two gods. In fact, I've got a new plan for you, God says. I want you to go and pick your successor. It's a guy named Elisha. And so over the rest of the chapters in 1 Kings, Elijah starts mentoring Elisha and showing him what it means to be a prophet of God. And together they do amazing things. And then in chapter 2 of 2 Kings, just before Elijah gets taken up to heaven in that chariot of fire, that amazing sort of scene, Elisha asks for a double share of Elijah's spirit. And the baton is passed. And I was thinking about this story, and I'm reminded of two things. First of all, we are never the only ones that are on God's side. I've had to learn that as a pastor. I'm not the only person that can be the pastor of this church or of Hilo Church or of Christ Church. There are always people that have gone before and those that will come after. But even in whatever area of life God's called you to serve and to help and to reach out, you're never the only one. Even though it may seem like you're all alone and no one else is helping or living the way that Christ wants them to live, there's always others. So God says, don't be discouraged. There are others in this as well. We are just one part of the larger body of Christ. And I know at this church, many faithful individuals have come before, both as lay and clergy, and many faithful ones will come after. Second, I love the mentoring and shared ministry that Elijah and Elisha had. In some ways, Pastor Glenn Murray was a mentor to me. He was my high school pastor, and after I went to college at UH and then to seminary and then my first two appointments, which got me back to Hilo, we still stayed in connection. And Pastor Dick Matsushita, who was here for so long, he was connected to us in college. He was part of our wedding. He created the origami. Jody folded the 1001 cranes, and he put it together in the Japanese character Ai, which means love. And we've stayed, and he was a part of my ordination committee. And so these two men of faith who have served here kind of helped mentor me and get me ready to be the pastor here. And I won't be so brash as to attempt to say that I've had anything to do with mentoring Pastor Tom Choi, who's my boss. He doesn't need any of my mentoring, but I do consider him a friend and a colleague. And together, working in the Hawaii district, we've prayed together and studied together and planned and visioned about where God is leading all of our churches in Hawaii and how God is helping us wanting us to grow deeper and stronger as United Methodists. And he doesn't need a double share of my spirit. He's got enough of his own spirit, powerful in a dynamic ministry. He's an amazing administrator, great visionary. He's really going to help this church move in a new direction. The second baton story from the Bible that God placed upon my heart surrounded John the Baptist. You remember Johnny B, right? He was Jesus' cousin. He's the guy that ate bugs and wore the scratchy clothes, and he called everyone to repent. And he lived out in the wilderness. He was a dynamic preacher. Anyone came out to hear him preach. And he said, you got to get your life in order. Get yourself good with God, because someone amazing is coming. The Messiah is coming. And you have to be ready. You don't want to miss it. And he says, as a way of symbolically being ready, get in the water with me. And he baptized people and said, as you go under the water, you're dying to your old self and the sins. And as you come up, God's going to give you a new start. And he called everyone to account. Religious leaders, soldiers, lawyers, politicians. No one was off limits. He wanted everyone to get right with God. And he became so popular that some of the religious leaders took offense. And they're like, well, who gave you permission to do this? Right? What authority do you have? Are you the Messiah? He said, no. Well, do you think you're like Elijah or something coming back from the Old Testament? No, he said. Are you some kind of prophet? And then he replied this, John 1:23. John said, I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as the prophet Isaiah has said. And really, that's our job. That's all of our jobs. Not just pastors, but laity as well, to point others to the Messiah, to point others to Jesus. Because when we're at our best, that's when others aren't focusing on us, but they're wondering, what is it that gives us joy and hope and passion, and how can we do the things to reach out and care and love for others the way we can? We do that because of Jesus Christ. So as I finish my 15 years of ministry here, it's my deepest hope and prayer that you will have come to know Jesus a little bit more than before I came or before you got here, but also that others will come to know Jesus more because of you and your life and witness. That's what was memorable about the pastors that have gone before. Reverend Evans, Reverend Bimson, Reverend Harada, Reverend Anderson, Reverend Matsushita, Reverend Murray. Each of them, when at their best, pointed others to Jesus. When I began this series 2 weeks ago, I told you about my extensive track and field experience from my junior high and elementary track and field team at Mojave Elementary. Coach Howell had taught us the proper mechanics of a relay race, and I loved running the 220-yard relay. So for most tracks that are a quarter mile long, the 220 is basically half a lap. But it's not half a lap per relay member, it's half a lap for 4 racers. It's a very fast race. There's very little margin of error. The teams that are most successful are the ones, not necessarily with the fastest runners, but the ones that could pass the baton efficiently and effectively. Jody and I were talking about this a couple weeks ago, and she started writing down the different components of a relay race, and we realized how that fit into what we're doing here. It starts with the runner looking back at the race. Now, as long as you're not the very first runner in the race, it's okay to look back, right? You have to see what has happened in the race prior to coming to you. And I look back on the 15 years of being in ministry with you together, and a lot of memories come to mind. Our Samoan brothers and sisters, and being able to celebrate with them and hear them sing and see them dance and just be a part of the different way that they celebrate life and faith has been amazing. I remember in just a few years after I started serving here, we had to expand to 2 services. We took the 9 o'clock service and we pushed it up to 9:30, and we added the 8 o'clock service for the early risers, right? And I think we're the earliest worship service in all of Hawaii for United Methodist. Kona is a close second. We were there last week with the youth group, and they worship at 8:30. And I remember then a few weeks later, we added the audio-visual components, and how for many people that's a big change, right? And we get to see the hymns on the wall, and we can look up and sing with our heads up rather than our heads down. We get to see pictures of each other's mothers and fathers and babies that are born, and we're not there in the hospital with them. And we get other elements of the service, and I can include things in my sermon to help highlight and bring even deeper connection to what I'm preaching about. I remember when we started passion groups as a way of helping to get to know each other better, because as long as I've been here, well, actually for 40 years, Aiea Korean United Methodist Church has been with us. And it's been a blessing and a challenge to have 2 medium-sized congregations together in one place. The challenge is there's never enough space or enough time, right? So we go from 8 to 9:30 in English, 11:15 for the Korean worship, 2 o'clock for the Samoan worship, and there's no time in between to kind of hang out and fellowship and have Bible studies in small groups. So passion groups were an opportunity to get to know one another deeper throughout the week. The slogan of passion groups is that anything is ministry and anyone can be a minister. So you find things you really like to do, stuff that you're already doing, and you want to involve others. We've had gardening groups, hula groups, golfing groups, movie groups, lay-making groups, personal finance group, a painting group, a Bible study group, a cooking group, and a going out to restaurants to eat group. We had a caregiver support group. The list goes on and on. Anything can be a ministry when it's done in Christian community, and anyone can be a minister. And I believe that passion groups have had a tremendous impact on the spiritual and relational development of this church. I remember the big risk that our leaders took 5 years ago in bringing Pastor Peter on board to launch our life communities, and how we made a commitment to put financial resources on the list. The first 3 years, the conference helped us with a 75% scholarship, and then it went down to 50%, and then this past year was 25%, and the leadership made the commitment before we knew Peter was going to be moved to Trinity to do 100% of his salary and ministry, because we felt it was important. We knew there were people that would never come to church on Sunday morning. That they're outside the walls of this church, and they might not come to any church, but they would get together with people they know and cared about to talk about things that matter. And in 5.5 years, Peter helped pastor and mentor over 300 people through that ministry. God has done amazing things through the risk that you and our leadership took. And in the past 1.5 years, we've been doing Messy Church, a dynamic and vibrant ministry that reaches out to people of all ages, of multi-generations, through the use of storytelling and arts and crafts and games and dinner. And everyone is welcome, and we focus on a particular theme each month. This month, if you haven't been, come. It's the last Saturday of every month, 5 to 7. The theme this month is Our Cup Overflows, and everything is going to deal with cups. Crafts and games and stories dealing around cups. I could talk about our consistent mission giving, our involvement with IHS, the commitment to Aiea Elementary School, Camp Mekukiko. It could go on and on. It's a wonderful view looking back over the last 15 years. But it's a relay race, right? And so we can't just look back. A teammate also needs to turn forward in advance of the upcoming runner. Now, if you've never been in a relay race before, you might think that you keep looking until the guy or girl gives you the baton and then you turn around and go. But that's actually the best way to come in last place. To keep turning around and looking. You lose so much momentum if you're always looking back. That's where we are now, friends. We need to turn and face ahead. The next relay member, we have to turn forward, and we've had the initial shock. Can you believe it's been 3 months since Blake Vance got up and read the letter from the bishop saying that both Peter and I would be reappointed to different churches effective July 1. And we cried and we sighed and we wondered what would life be like come July 1. And tonight we'll get to celebrate a little bit more together. We celebrated Pastor Peter a few weeks ago, and if you're available at 5 o'clock, come. Bring something to share or bring cookies. We'll have a great time. But July 1 is approaching fast. And this is my last sermon as your senior pastor. It's not my last service with you, but my last sermon. And the time has come for us to start to face forward and to get ready for the next leg of the relay. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to forget. We don't forget. But it means it's time to prepare for this next phase. And before we can receive the baton, we have to run hard and fast ahead. I remember Coach Howell telling us that if we timed it right, I think it's about 10 yards away, then we should take 4 great giant strides before we reach our hand back. 4, not 4, oh, I'm not really sure, I don't know what's going to be, is the person still there, what's the future going to be like? Not timid steps, 4 big, full speed ahead, giant strides. Our church has a lot of mission and ministry ahead of us, and we can't put everything on hold even until July 1. We have weekly ministries ongoing like Sunday school, and there are wonderful people that are volunteering right now while we're in church teaching and guiding our young people. We have youth group. We have vacation Bible school that starts a week from tomorrow. We have Messy Church that's coming up 2 Saturdays from now. We have committees and mission projects that need volunteers and participants. And each of us have to be involved in the total life of this church, not just on Sunday mornings, if we want to keep the momentum going. We need to be running hard and fast forward. And then after we take those 4 steps, we're called to reach back our hand. To me, this was my favorite part. Well, actually, winning the race was my favorite part, but this was second, right? That moment when things, if they have gone right, when things clicked for our relay team, and I've looked back, and I saw the runner getting to the right spot, and I turned ahead, and I did my 4 giant strides, and I reached back my hand to feel the baton being placed in my hand and be able to move with no delay. That was amazing, right? I had trained to do that, and we had practiced that way, and I expected to receive the baton, but until it gets in my hand, I wasn't quite sure, and then to feel that baton there. So you know where this analogy is going, right? On July 1, Pastor Tom will be the new spiritual leader of this church. And for many of us, myself included, it's going to be a big, big change. But if it's going to work the way that the bishop feels it can, and she is so excited about what Tom brings and his gifts and abilities to be able to help this church, in different ways than I did. If it's going to work that way, then each and every one of us have to reach back our hands to Pastor Tom and to pull him in and welcome him as a part of our hearts and our lives, because he's coming. And if we want to keep the momentum of this church going, what we've been doing over the years, then we have to be ready to welcome him with open arms. And then finally, if we want to have a successful passing of the baton, we have to trust our teammates. Now, I alluded to this in a previous point, but relays always involve a team. And it's not a one-person race. In fact, sometimes you can have the fastest person on your team, but you still may not win if the passing doesn't go smoothly. Teams that win are the ones who trust their teammates to fulfill their roles. So we need to trust, first and foremost, that God is the one who's orchestrating this transition. We need to trust that the bishop and the cabinet had prayerfully considered, deliberated, and discerned God's direction for our church. We need to trust that Pastor Tom is the right one to take us to the next level into the future. We need to trust each other, that we have what it takes to continue in the high standards of mission and ministry that has been Aiea UMC. And we need to trust that God will provide more teammates in the future. When July 1 rolls around, the church will have lost 2 pastors, a choir director, a pastoral assistant, a secretary, a Christian ed director, a youth leader, and a financial clerk, with only the financial clerk being rehired. Oh, and Pastor Tom comes in as a new pastor, right? There are a lot of pukas in the ministry of this staffing that face Pastor Tom, but he knows that. The SBRC has been working very closely with him to prepare him for that, and he's been thinking about and praying about and planning for whoever it is that God is going to bring into those or other spots to fill out his team. So what we can do is be praying along with him. And we don't know if that team's going to be ready to go on July 1 or August 1 or September 1. Whenever that comes, trust that God will bring the right people. And we know that God will bring more people to the church, right? One of the things that I love about this church is how well you welcome and release people. I think I shared this before. One of the biggest fears I had when I knew that I was moving before I could announce it was that it might be hard for some of you to release me, but you have done so well. You welcome military people all the time, whether they're here for 3 years or 3 months. And then you send them off, and it's never oh, don't go, how can you leave us, what are we going to do without you? It's always, take the love of this church with you. And that's how you've released me as well. God will send more people to this church. So let us be expectant. And maybe you can invite a few others of your neighbors that you think as well. But we know that God always replaces when he sends people away in mission and ministry. So trust our teammates in the transition. Now, I want to close with this personal note. It's a quote from Shauna Nyquist. Shauna was a speaker at the HIM conference. And I've heard her speak, and she's wonderful and a great writer. And in her book, Bittersweet, she has a chapter called The Closer You Get. And she's talking about this small group of friends of hers. And they have gotten together for food and dinners with families. They've loved each other's kids and helped each other out, and they prayed for one another. And then they find, get this, one of them is moving to California. It always throws things off, right, when people move to California. And she's reflecting on how that's going to change their group. She writes this. Of all the things, of all the thousands of memories and snapshots of our lives together, from college to trips to weddings to the last 3 years in Grand Rapids, there is this one thing that rises above everything else like a siren, like a smoke signal. It's this. The closer you get, the closer you get. I didn't always know how to open myself deeply. Moving to Grand Rapids, a town that was tricky for me for all sorts of reasons. And the fear and the loneliness of it snapped my heart shut like a drum. And then Annette and Andrew moved across the country and into our neighborhood. And day by day, phone call by phone call, breakfast by breakfast, Annette taught me that the closer you get, the closer you get. That when you allow someone past all the doors you were taught to keep closed, what you find behind those doors is a kind of friendship I didn't even have a category for. I spent most of my life and most of my friendships holding my breath and hoping that when people get close enough, they won't leave, and fearing that it's just a matter of time before they figure me out and go. But she said things changed with these friendships. And then despite the fact that Annette and family were moving to California, she realized the distance between them was only in their heart. And it wasn't that far at all. So friends, no matter where life takes us, from Aiea to Trinity to Palmdale, California, or anywhere else in God's creation, we will always be a part of each other's lives. What's the scene from E.T. when E.T. is about to go back and Elliot, and they're all crying like I'm about to cry now. And E.T. points to his heart and says, ouch. And Elliot says, I'll be right here. That's where it is. The grace of God will hold us together. I mentioned I'm now the longest serving pastor in Aiea's history. This is also the longest I've ever lived in any one place. So you know that's not going to go away. That will always be a part of me. Thank you for opening your hearts and your lives and your families. Thank you for a wonderful 15 years, and the journey continues. Amen.